Ok, Arratsaldeon, buenas tardes.
Hi, good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to a new press conference of the official section of the San Sebastian Film Festival. And we're presenting the film today, Benediction. We have to present it with us. We have the actor, Jack Lowden, the producer, Mike Elliott, and we also have virtually the director, that is to say online, Terrence Davies. So therefore, it takes your photos now. Hi. Please take your photos. Hi. Okay. Please raise your hand for any questions that you may have. I would like to commence, nevertheless, with a question of my own for the director. Before I ask it, I want to congratulate you for the film that we've just seen, that most of us have seen. We've just left the film theater, and it's been a cleansing of the soul, I must say. And I must say also that bearing in mind your prior filmography, where you give a lot of importance to memory, to what you remember, and to entity, how do you approach in this film the fact that there's such an important part in the present tense, or at the present time? Literally and explicitly, we have characters that are thinking in their past or of their past, whether this was different vis-a-vis your previous films and the way you've treated memory.
I've been obsessed with time ever since I discovered T.S. Eliot's four quartets, which are some of the greatest poetry in English. And it's about the nature of time and memory and reflection of how we are and how we perceive ourselves and the world and how much the world perceives us. I've always been attached to that. And I think where memory is concerned, you can move in and out of memory at any time in your own life because you have the backstory. But when you're creating a life, you have to make sure that you just don't become obscure and confusing. One of the things I've always done in any film, I go from one emotional thing to the next, not what literally happens next, because I don't think that's very interesting. But it comes down literally to my obsession with time and our perception of it.
Okay, thank you so much. Vamos con...
Okay, another question. Hi, a question for Terrence Davies and for Jack Lowden as well. My question for Mr. Davies is, how did you hit upon the character of Siegfried? How did you get to know about him, whether you'd known him already in the past? Did you know about his poetry? Or who provided those poems, and then you were interested in his history? Jack Lowden, you're also an executive producer in the film, I seem to see him. And how are you've got that twofold role in the film, and also, how was the working with Terrence Davies, a director of his stature and background? Thank you. Probably the best bet, yes.
I discovered Siegfried Sassoon when I was about to go to drama school. Those days you had to do a piece of Shakespeare and a piece of your own choice. And I did Concert Interpretation by Sassoon, which is a great poem, a great comic poem about the first performance in Britain of The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. Wonderful poem, wonderful language. And I didn't really know him as much as I knew Rupert Brooke and Wilfred Owen, who were the other two great war poets who were both killed. I then had to research this film, which was massive. I mean, 3 huge biographies. He went everywhere, he knew everybody, and it was very difficult to decide what to leave out. So what I did was I responded to the things in his life that I thought I could dramatize. The fact that he was gay, and I am. The fact that he got married, which a lot of gay men did in the 30s. His poetry becoming a great poet because of the First World War. And then finally, the most shocking thing of all, he becomes a Catholic, and I speak as an ex-Catholic, and I wonder, why on earth did he do it?
Working with Terrence was one of the most exceptional experiences I've ever had. It was just as a film fan to get to work with someone like Terrence after I've seen and adored films like Deep Blue Sea, which I think is as close as you get to a perfect film with perfect performances. It was a little bit terrifying to be handed the opportunity to then be in one of his films. But for me, more than anything, the opportunity to play Sassoon was a great honor. To play him, to play a man of his bravery and honesty is very rare now in film, particularly someone who existed and, you know, in particular the First World War, the way that that's covered in the film and the way that he tackled the First World War, to have at first been very, very pro-war and gone to war and actually been a terrific soldier and a terrific leader by all accounts. In fact, was nicknamed Mad Jack. He was that brave. Was quite incredible to then produce that letter that he did, that basically said that we thought war was a fool's errand, and it was. And that war, the First World War in particular, back at home, is remembered with a great sentimentality, and it's very important that these films are made to remind us, in particular back home, of how much of a disaster that war was, and how it robbed people of their lives for very little reason. And to play somebody who realised that in the thick of it and take the stand that he did, where he might have gone to jail or at worst been shot, is a real honour. And particularly when I read his letter, the very letter that he wrote that is in the film, I found that the most difficult part of making the film. And we actually did that the day, 2 or 3 days before we actually started shooting. That was the most terrifying part, and that's probably not answering your question, but I can't remember the question. But so I've made my own question up. Hopefully that it still answers something that someone wants to know. Yeah, there you go.
Also, he was asking about your role as a producer. Maybe you both can talk a little bit about how the production process work.
Well, Mike's the best person to answer that, but my role as that was very minimal to a certain extent, because the film, like many films, we were 3 days from shooting, and then the film shut down with everything with COVID. And but I didn't want to let the opportunity of playing this character go. So I through the whole of the pandemic, I just wanted to make that film. But in terms of production, yeah, Mike's the best.
Well, we sort of began the pre-production about 5 or 6 years ago, Terrence, I think. And Jack came on board about 18 months before we started shooting. So I think in part it was about recognising that attachment to the project. But also we were thinking of shooting in Scotland at the time, and Jack had a production company in Scotland, so we were going to access some funding there. That didn't in the end work out, but I think it was really sort of testament to Jack's sort of involvement with us from a very early stage, being part of the casting that led to, you know, helping us to build the finance. So that was principally the role.
Okay.
Hi, my question is for Jack. The dialogues are beautifully written, but they look so hard to remember. How do you memorize a script like that? Do you have any tricks? Is it as hard as it seems?
It's very hard when the script is really bad, which I think every actor under the sun will tell you they've had an experience with. This, fortunately, was not one of those experiences. Lines are very difficult to learn when they don't make sense. And every single one of Terrence's lines made complete sense. Each line was the natural responder to the one before it. And it's very, very rare to find a script like that. And so it's a lot easier to learn. I also have the added thing of I very rarely get to use my own accent. I've played maybe 2 roles in my own accent for whatever reason, but I find it hard to learn lines in a different accent. So to learn this, I would first learn it in my own accent, and then stick on the RP, as it's called in the UK, the sort of posh English accent. But it was very, very easy to learn the lines. But of course, because of the pandemic, I learnt the lines in, January 2020, and then I had about 8 months to make them even more second nature. And I ran them a lot in the bath. With, which I don't know why that was the natural place to run Sassoon's lines, but it felt very apt. And I also played a lot of Ivor Novello music whilst I was in the bath for about 6 months. A lot of his piano arrangements were wonderful to learn lines by, and I'd highly recommend it. Yeah.
My question is for Mr. Terence Davies. Is it true that your film has elements that you reiterate, shall we say, from the previous films that you've made? Yes, the passing of time and nostalgia, but your characters, it seems that they're always trying to be themselves, and they're invaded by a sense of bitterness. What reflection does this bring about? That is to say, the way your characters end up in that situation.
I don't think any of them end up embittered. I think Emily Dickinson does in the last one. I suspect that I've always been afraid of ending up like that. I mean, if I may quote one of her lines, we become the very thing we dread, and I have become embittered. I don't think that the people are embittered. I think they're shocked by what has happened and how they respond to it, which is not the same thing. I think they may come close to despair, which is the most unbearable of all things. But I don't think that they're embittered. But in a way, isn't everybody constantly trying to find what they think they are? Some people may achieve it. I mean, I haven't. But I have great sympathy for people who have gone on that journey, and it's left open. And I think at the end of Sassoon's life, he hadn't found himself. He hadn't found redemption. Because in the end, if you don't find it within yourself, then you never find it at all. You can't find it through other people, art, or religion.
Yeah. Peter Paul Hoot from Germany. Question to Terence Davies. Well, I was very taken by the beauty of the film, and the way you combined the dramatic structure with the imagery, the footage from the archives. How did this idea come about? Because it works so well together.
Well, quite honestly, it was a very simple decision to make. The problem with films made about 1914 to 18 in this country is that it's always preceded by this long Edwardian summer where everybody floated around looking beautiful. And if you were working in a factory or down a mine, it wasn't wonderful, it was awful. So that was a cliche I wanted to avoid. And when I saw the footage of the First World War, which is both monstrous and beautiful, I thought what we have to do is we make the interiors in Britain sumptuous, so you get the sense of what they've come from and what they're going to. It was purely that, but also there was a monetary thing. If you hire costumes and make them too dirty, the costumier will not take them back, and you've got to pay for them. And we didn't have that kind of money.
Hi, it's Rodrigo from Brazil. A question to Terrence Davis. Two questions, in fact. The first one, I would like to hear a few words about your work with Nicola Daly, your cinematographer. And the second question is, this film, Benediction, is one of the most powerful cinematic experiences of this festival. And as your cinema usually is, but how to deal with this cinematic dimension in times of streaming culture? How do you face your films on a digital platform, Mr. Davis?
I have absolutely no idea. I'm a complete technophobe. I can't do anything. I've got a mobile phone, but if people leave messages on it, I can't retrieve them. I'm really hopeless. What was important to me was that the film got made. I have no idea how it's going to be shown. I hope it's going to be shown in the cinemas. I hope it goes on television. The problem, it always is, there are now so many ways of watching films, and I don't really want to watch my film on a toaster. That's not very good. That's not terribly exciting. So I have no idea. I have no idea how it's shown now. The best way is, of course, in a cinema, in the dark, with the light flickering above you at 24 frames per second. You create magic for a whole lot of people, but individually, everyone thinks the secret is only being told to me. That's the real magic at 25 frames per second.
And also the question about the cinematographer.
I hadn't seen any of her work, and I interviewed 3 cinematographers, and I just felt she was right. It's as vague as that. I just sort of knew. You can tell. I just thought, I think she'll be pretty good, and pretty good she was too.
Hi, a question for Terrence Davies. I would like to know the casting process, not only for Jack Lowden, but for the rest of the cast. Thank you very much.
Well, what's wonderful now is that a lot of actors do self-tapes, and that's really wonderful. It's wonderful for them because they don't have to go into a room with 3 people in that they've never heard before and give a performance. I can also look at them repeatedly and get what I feel from whatever self-tape there is. But Jack and I met for just for a drink, and we just talked. And I just knew he was right. I just knew he was right. And then he did a wonderful self-tape. One of the scenes with Dr. Rivers, and the lines are, I don't know why I come, it hasn't achieved anything. And when he delivered that line, his voice broke in the middle, and I thought, we've definitely found him. You can tell.
Hi, I have a question for Terrence Davies. Nowadays, there are a lot of movies with gay characters, but when you started, there weren't almost any. I would love to know, how do you feel? What's the biggest difference you've experienced as a filmmaker between the 70s and right now concerning gay characters? Thank you.
Well, I've never been one for the gay scene. When I came out, I went onto it for 2 or 3 months, and I was appalled. I was just appalled by the sexual venality and the narcissism, and I can't live like that, which is why I decided to be celibate and have been for the past 40 years. What I didn't want is that this awful sort of cliche where they're all gorgeous and they take off their shirts and they've been to the gym. Oh, that's just so dull. It's just dull. But also I wanted to show how nasty that world can be, and it can be very, very nasty indeed, but it can be very, very funny as well. So you've got to have both, and I wanted to combine both. But also, what you also must remember, Sassoon was from the privileged classes, and a lot of gay men from that class got away with it because they knew people. If you were lower middle class or working class, you went to prison for 2 years. Because in my country, homosexuality was a criminal offense until 1967. But apropos that, what is wonderful about young gay people now, they are able to say what they are, how they are, and not have that dreadful contempt that used to be especially in the word queer, which I really do hate, because when I was growing up in the 50s, it was said with such hatred and viciousness, I cannot use it. So I think we've moved on a lot since then. But I just didn't want it to be, good-looking men taking their clothes off, because there's nothing more more boring. The only thing that's more boring than that is watching Formula One racing.
Sí, a mí de hecho yo tenía...
In fact, I have a question related to something that you were talking about. Is I say all of the films, Terrence Davies films as a director have a lot of photography, staging, and script and dialogues, etc. But in this specific case, the dialogues are continuously ingenious, very sharp, very biting. Was it difficult to get? Did that come out naturally vis-a-vis the script, or was it very difficult to come to that point where the dialogues were so incisive?
Dialogue always appears to you. You feel it. You feel it when you're writing a character. And the thing you've got to do is make sure that all the characters speak in their own voice and not have the same tone. That's really, really important. But really, the dry run for this was Emily Dickinson, A Quiet Passion. That family were very well educated, very sharp, and I wanted it to be sharp as well. And I wanted this to be sharp as well. Because they were of that sort of background where they had that ease with language, going to an extreme where Edith Sitwell is concerned. These poems mean they're incomprehensible. They're incomprehensible. But she was such a wonderful person. She sat in bed under a mosquito net. I mean, how can you not make that funny? And I didn't want it to be solemn. Because he's a great poet and he had a hard life in many ways, I didn't want it to be solemn, because there's nothing better than passion and humor. Humor's wonderful. And I do think still, even in this country, in the modern age, the British are very, very funny, and particularly parts of the country, particularly the north of England. And we have the ability in my country to laugh at ourselves and to see just what a ridiculous little country we are.
Hi, it's Rodrigo again from Brazil. I would like to understand, Mr. Davis, what's the biggest challenge of dealing with the word, the spoken word, in a film about poetry, and how to deal with the lyrical dimension of silence in a film about a craftsman of verses, of poetry?
Well, the template was Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. When I was 18, we had our first television, and over 4 nights, Alec Guinness read the whole of the Four Quartets from memory. I mean, I was absolutely knocked out. I didn't understand a word of them, but I went out and bought them. And I read them regularly, sometimes almost once a month, because it is such an exploration of time and the nature of time, how we change when we perceive something. There's a wonderful line at the beginning of Four Quartets where he says, "For the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at." Isn't that fabulous? Isn't that it's so fabulous? You've got to have that. But also, when I was growing up, the two things that I was obsessed with were American musicals, because my sisters loved them and they were always witty, and British comedy of the period, we had wonderful people then, really wonderful. We haven't got them anymore. So it was wonderful to go and see people like Alistair Sim or Margaret Rutherford or Joyce Grenfell. These names probably don't mean anything to you, but they had an intrinsic sense of comedy. They didn't try to be funny. So that was really my template really, and I did want to write some jokes. So I hope the laughometer was very high.
Hi, Cedric Souchively, International Cinephile Society. First and foremost, I would like to congratulate Mr. Davis because, I mean, you said recently in a screen interview that you think it's your best film, and I have to agree with you. I think it's a tremendous, towering achievement, even by your own standards. And I have a question for Jack Lowden. I would like to find out a little bit more about how you find your inspiration for those last 2 minutes in what is probably one of the most devastating closing scene that I've seen in a long while, this long take on the bench. And where do you take your inspiration, I mean, in terms of emotions to provide such a cathartic and totally devastating moment?
So I haven't seen the film. I should probably say that. But I've read the script and I was there when they were made, because I struggle to watch myself at the moment. I think it's just an eternal disappointment when you just all I see is myself in a wig, and that's just really sort of it's not as magical as your experience. So I'll leave it to you guys. But I remember the last scene. We had one attempt at it. Basically, we were on a bench, and at a certain time of night to get magic hour, get the right light. So it was difficult, but I think it was just one of those scenes where everything sort of came together. And I'd like to give you a really sort of pretentious answer, but my answer of how we did that scene was as I was driving to set. I was driving, and there's a station in the UK called Classic FM, which plays classic music. And the track, is it Spiegel and Spiegel? Spiegel, someone will know what that is, was on the radio, and I found it really, really sad. And so I thought I'll listen to that before we did the scene. So I listened to this incredibly moving, beautiful piano before we did the scene, and sat down, and Terrence was over to my left reading the Wilfred Owen poem. And there was just something about the Spiegel and Spiegel track that I listened to, matched with Terrence's reading of the poem, that just made it work. And it's quite a hard thing to do, but it's also incredibly easy when, for him, I felt with Sassoon, the whole point of Sassoon was that if ever he showed something, it was reluctantly, or he wanted to show it in a more interesting way but never could. So I didn't want him to sit on the bench and just start wailing, with wailing and wailing and wailing, which is probably what he wanted to do in that point. It's always more interesting to watch someone trying not to wail. So I tried to do that as much as possible. But I haven't seen it. Everybody keeps telling me about that one scene. So I'm glad it was effective, because we had one go and everything just worked, I think, which was just luck more than anything.
Vale, pues desgraciadamente.
Well, unfortunately, we have to close the press conference here with this question up on the end of the film. A big round of applause, please, for the cast and the director and the producer.